Chosen ones, be careful. You are 100% right. What you are feeling right now is not random, and you are not imagining it, because what is about to enter your life is already being sensed by your inner awareness before it fully appears in your external reality. There is a shift happening around you, connected to sudden love, and your intuition is already picking up on it, even if your mind has not fully understood it yet. This is why your emotions have been slightly unsettled, and why certain thoughts about connection, timing, and people have been coming and going without clear explanation. Because something is changing in your emotional field, and I need you to pay attention to this carefully. What you understand in this moment can prepare you for what is about to unfold and keep you from misreading the signs that are already forming around you. If you stay until the end, clarity will settle in your awareness, and you will move forward with a stronger understanding of why certain connections are about to shift in your life. Type Amen to affirm. I am showing you that what you are sensing is not confusion. It is awareness of a transition that is already in motion. The reason this feeling has not left you is because the situation is still developing beneath the surface, even if nothing obvious has changed externally yet. And I do not want you to ignore what is being revealed through your inner awareness right now. There is a connection, a shift, or an unexpected emotional opening that is beginning to form around you in ways that are still invisible, but not absent. And I need you to understand this clearly. What is coming into your life is not being forced. It is unfolding. And your awareness is simply beginning to notice it before it fully arrives. The signs may appear small or subtle, but your inner perception is already recognizing the pattern behind them. You are not overthinking. You are becoming aware of something that others may not understand yet. Before you continue, take a moment and like this video, because what you are receiving right now is not ordinary, and it could shift how you understand your next emotional experience if you truly stay connected to it. Something is going to feel uncomfortable at first, because what you've been calling a delay in love might not be a delay at all. It might be something far more precise than that. You didn't lose love. You lost access to the version of yourself that used to distort it. And until that difference becomes clear internally, nothing in your external pattern will make full sense. From your point of view, it feels like people come close and then disappear. Connection starts with intensity and then collapses without explanation. And timing always feels slightly off, like something never fully aligns, no matter what you do. The mind naturally tries to explain this through external reasons. Wrong people, bad luck, wrong timing. But that explanation is too simple for what is actually happening. The detail you've been missing is that it is not that love is inconsistent. It is that you were consistent in a state that distorted how love entered your experience. That state didn't feel like a problem at the time because it was familiar. It was automatic. You didn't question it because you had no contrast to compare it with. But now something is shifting quietly, not in your external life yet, but in your internal reactions. And when internal reactions begin to change, everything that used to feel stable starts to feel slightly unfamiliar. Not better, not worse. Just unfamiliar in a way that is difficult to immediately interpret. There was a time when you would have ignored these subtle feelings. You would have stayed silent just to keep emotional situations smooth, telling yourself that everything was fine, even when something inside felt slightly off. You would have assumed that overthinking was the problem rather than the pattern itself. Because maintaining connection used to feel more important than understanding it. But now, that is changing. Now, you are not only feeling your reactions, you are noticing them as they happen. You are observing before you respond. And that changes everything in ways most people don't immediately recognize. This shift is not small. It is a structural change in how your emotional system processes experience. Awareness slows reaction. And when reaction slows, attachment is no longer automatic. It becomes visible. And once something becomes visible, it stops controlling you in the same way it used to. This is why things feel different now. You're not becoming less emotional. You're becoming less reactive to emotional impulses that used to guide your decisions without question. And that difference alone changes how relationships form, develop, and collapse around you. Most people misinterpret this stage of growth. They assume distance means loss, silence means absence, and reduced urgency means something is fading away. But what is actually fading is not love itself. It is the compulsion to chase it in distorted ways. That compulsion used to feel like connection, but it wasn't. It was urgency trying to turn itself into attachment before clarity had time to form. Now that urgency is slowing down. And in that slowing, something unfamiliar appears. It doesn't feel like peace at first. It feels like space. Space where you're no longer forcing meaning onto every interaction, no longer interpreting every signal as direction, no longer building emotional conclusions faster than reality can confirm them. That space feels uncomfortable only because you are not used to it yet. But discomfort is not always a warning. Sometimes, it is simply the feeling of stability without emotional noise. And in that silence, distortion begins to fade, and clarity begins to take its place. Let's slow this down and make it very concrete. Think about the last few people you felt something for, not in theory, not in a romantic idea of yourself, but in actual real moments. If you trace it honestly, a pattern usually appears much earlier than you want to admit. At the beginning, nothing dramatic is happening externally. There is no confirmed relationship, no clear direction, no solid foundation. But internally, something starts moving fast. Not in what the other person is doing, but in how quickly your mind begins to build meaning around what they do. A simple conversation that would normally stay simple suddenly starts to carry weight. You replay it later. You analyze tone, timing, wording. A small gesture, something casual, maybe even accidental, starts to feel like it has direction behind it, like it is pointing somewhere. Even silence, which should be neutral, starts to feel loaded. It becomes something you interpret instead of something you simply observe. And without realizing it, the actual person is no longer the main focus. You are now interacting more with your interpretation of them than with who they actually are in front of you. That is the turning point most people miss entirely. Because once interpretation becomes stronger than evidence, perception starts to drift. You are no longer grounded in what is happening. You are partially living in what could be happening. And the mind does not stay passive in that state. It begins to fill gaps. It starts assigning meaning where none has been confirmed yet. And that is where emotional compensation begins. You don't notice it as a decision. It doesn't feel like I am investing too much. It feels natural. You give slightly more attention than is being returned. You think slightly more about them than the interaction justifies. You start reading slightly deeper into things that may not have depth yet. None of it feels extreme in isolation. But together, it creates an imbalance that slowly builds in the background. And here is the part people resist accepting. The other person does not need to consciously reject you for distance to form. They don't need a clear decision, a direct statement, or a dramatic ending. Most of the time, they only need to sense something in the dynamic that feels slightly off. Not wrong, not bad, just uneven. Because human connection is not only about interest, it is also about pacing. And when one person is emotionally ahead of what has actually developed, even if their intentions are good, it creates pressure that is hard to name, but easy to feel. The other person may not explain it. They may not even understand it fully themselves. But something in them starts to pull back, not out of rejection, but out of instinctive self-correction. Not because you were unworthy, but because intensity without grounding changes how safe a connection feels to move forward in. So when you look back honestly, what repeats is not a clear story of rejection. It is a pattern of emotional pacing being slightly out of sync at the very beginning, before anything real has a chance to stabilize. Same emotional acceleration, different people, same ending pattern. And until that is seen clearly, it keeps repeating in new forms while feeling like a different story each time. Now here is where things start to shift, and most people completely misread what is happening inside them at this stage. There is a phase that does not feel like improvement at all. In fact, if you are not aware of what is actually changing, it can feel like something is being taken away from you. It does not feel like clarity or strength or emotional maturity. It feels like distance. It feels like you are becoming less responsive, less interested, less emotionally engaged with things that used to pull you in very quickly. You might start noticing subtle but consistent changes. Less emotional urgency when meeting new people. Less internal excitement over potential outcomes that used to feel significant. Slower attachment, where you don't immediately assign meaning to early interactions. A reduced emotional reaction to attention that would have previously felt exciting or important. And because you are experiencing all of this without consciously choosing it, the mind tries to explain it in the fastest possible way. And the first interpretation is usually something like, "Something is wrong, I'm becoming cold." But that interpretation is based on comparison, not understanding. What is actually happening is not emotional loss. It is emotional recalibration away from dependency loops that used to run automatically in the background of your experience. Your system is no longer reacting instantly to emotional stimulation the way it used to. There is now a delay, a pause, a space between what you feel and how quickly you respond to it internally. And that space is extremely important, even though it feels unfamiliar. Because for a long time, there was no space at all. It was immediate reaction, immediate meaning, immediate emotional direction. Now there is a gap. And that gap is what your mind is struggling to interpret, because anything unfamiliar gets labeled as emptiness before it is understood as structure. So instead of recognizing this as a change in processing speed, your mind starts generating explanations to fill the silence. Maybe I'm losing interest in love. Maybe I missed something important. Maybe nothing meaningful is going to happen anymore. But none of these conclusions are based on what is actually occurring. They are based on discomfort with emotional silence. Because what you are experiencing is not absence of feeling. It is the removal of automatic emotional escalation that used to happen without your awareness. And that changes everything in ways you don't immediately notice. To understand why, you have to look at what was happening before this shift. Most of your past emotional cycles did not collapse because there was no real connection available. They collapsed because of early emotional overcommitment that began before stability was established. In simple terms, meaning was assigned too quickly. A person was no longer just a person in your experience. They became something larger in your internal narrative before there was enough evidence to support that meaning. They became a direction in your mind, a possibility, a projection of something that had not yet existed in reality. And once that happens, your behavior begins to change without conscious awareness. You start interpreting neutral interactions as signals. You begin over-prioritizing small moments that feel significant in your internal story, but are still neutral in real context. You begin investing emotionally before consistency has been established through actual experience. And at that point, something subtle but very real begins to form in the interaction. Even if the other person has interest, they are no longer interacting with a balanced emotional pace. They are interacting with a version of you that is already ahead of where the connection actually is. And that creates pressure. Not obvious pressure, not spoken pressure, but a kind of emotional imbalance that is felt more than it is explained. A sense that something is moving faster internally than it is externally. And human systems, by nature, respond to imbalance by creating distance, not always consciously, but instinctively. Not because you are wrong, not because they are rejecting you, but because connection requires synchronization, and misaligned pacing creates friction that neither person may fully understand in the moment. So when you look back honestly, what appears as repeated emotional failure is not actually random rejection or bad luck. It is a repeated pattern of emotional timing being out of sync at the very beginning stages of connection. You were early in meaning, but late in grounding. And that gap between meaning and grounding is what kept repeating across different people, different situations, and different outcomes. Until something inside you naturally begins to slow the process down before it fully forms. Now, here is the part most people misunderstand when they hear the phrase sudden love. They immediately assume something external is being delivered to them, as if love is a force being sent, timed, or assigned from outside their life. But that interpretation is already built on a misunderstanding of how perception actually shifts in real human interactions. That is not what is happening. What actually changes is something far more internal and far more subtle. Your signal stability. When you were emotionally reactive, your presence was not neutral. It carried an undercurrent that influenced how every interaction unfolded, even when nothing was explicitly said. There was urgency in the background, not always visible but felt in small ways. A subtle expectation that something should develop faster than it was naturally forming. An invisible pressure for clarity, for reassurance, for direction before the situation had reached that stage on its own. And even if you never expressed it directly, it was still part of the emotional atmosphere you were operating from. When that layer begins to drop, something changes in how you are perceived. But not in the dramatic way people imagine. You do not become louder. You do not become more impressive. You do not become someone different. You become harder to emotionally misread in a chaotic way. Not cold, not distant, but stable in a way that does not force interpretation. And stability has a very specific effect on human perception, because unstable emotional presence creates pressure without words. It makes interactions feel like they are carrying more weight than they should at that stage. It pushes the other person, even subtly, into a position where they feel they have to manage the emotional direction of the interaction. Stable emotional presence removes that pressure completely. And when pressure is removed, something very specific appears in its place. Curiosity. Not excitement based on intensity, but curiosity based on clarity. Because now, the interaction is no longer being shaped by emotional urgency from one side. It is simply unfolding without distortion. And that is where the shift happens. Quietly, not dramatically. Because for the first time, you are not actively pulling attention through emotional momentum. You are not trying to accelerate connection internally before it naturally develops externally. You are simply present without forcing interpretation onto what is happening. And here is the uncomfortable truth most people resist when they reach this stage. People who were previously unaware of you in a meaningful way can begin to notice you. Not because you changed who you are, but because you stopped broadcasting emotional need through your behavior. And when that signal disappears, perception changes. Not because you became more valuable, but because you became clearer to perceive. Let's remove fantasy from this completely and bring it down to what is actually happening in behavioral terms. Sudden love is not sudden creation of emotion. It is delayed recognition of presence. It happens when several internal shifts align without forcing it. Your emotional noise reduces, meaning you are no longer overloading interactions with interpretation before they mature. Your behavior becomes more consistent, meaning people experience you in a steadier pattern rather than emotional fluctuation. Your interpretation slows down, meaning you stop assigning meaning faster than reality can confirm it. And your presence stops pushing outcomes, meaning interactions are no longer subtly driven toward a conclusion. When these shifts happen together, something very simple becomes possible that was not possible before. People who were already around you, or people who enter your life later, begin to perceive you without distortion. Not through emotional projection, not through assumptions, not through pressure or expectation, but through direct experience of a stable presence that does not demand a direction too early. And that is what creates the feeling of suddenness. Not because love appears out of nowhere, but because clarity appears where distortion used to be. And clarity only becomes possible when emotional dependency is no longer shaping how you interpret every small signal in real time. When that dependency drops, perception becomes cleaner. And what was always there becomes visible in a way it wasn't before. So nothing about your situation actually requires you to chase harder, think more, or keep trying to decode signals that were never stable enough to decode in the first place. That entire approach is built on the assumption that clarity comes from effort, when in reality, a lot of emotional confusion comes from too much internal effort applied too early. The actual shift is quieter than that. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like a breakthrough moment. It feels almost underwhelming at first, because nothing dramatic is happening externally. But internally, the way you process situations begins to change in a very specific way. You stop over-interpreting small interactions as if they already contain full meaning. You stop taking incomplete signals and mentally finishing them into outcomes that have not been confirmed. You stop treating potential as if it is already reality. And most importantly, you stop investing emotional certainty into situations that are still in their earliest, most unstable stage. And when that happens, something subtle but very real starts to change in your external experience. You are no longer emotionally accelerating outcomes. You are no longer pushing interactions forward internally before they have naturally developed externally. There is less pressure in how you relate. Even if nothing about your words or actions looks different on the surface, the change is not in expression. The change is in timing. You begin to allow things to form at their own pace instead of trying to emotionally complete them early in your mind. And in that state, connection doesn't feel like pursuit anymore. It stops feeling like something you are actively trying to make happen through interpretation, analysis, or emotional investment. It becomes something that unfolds without force, without urgency, without the need for constant mental involvement. And when it does happen, it doesn't register as chaos or intensity. It registers as recognition, not because it is sudden in reality, but because you are finally seeing it without distortion, not because it is magical or externally orchestrated, but because your perception is no longer speeding ahead of what is actually happening. And that difference is what most people mistake for sudden love. What is actually sudden is not the arrival of connection. It is the moment your mind stops interfering with its formation.